Welcome to the All Sorts podcast. Imagine like this massive, ever-expanding library of ideas, right? Where every single thought has the potential to totally reshape how we see the world.
I like that image. It really captures the dynamism of thought.
Yeah, and today we're going to dive headfirst into the electrifying current of one of those really powerful minds, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Ah, Nietzsche. He's one of those figures who continues to spark debate and fascination even over a century later.
For sure, and our listener, you know who you are, has brought us this amazing collection of sources to work with today.
Yeah, we've got the in-depth analysis of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, the broader overview from Wikipedia, and then some really intriguing extra texts.
It's clear that our listener wants to go deep on this, understand the man, his philosophy, the impact he had, and still has.
It's an ambitious dive, but I think we're up for it.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to navigate this intellectual landscape together, make sense of it all, and come out the other side with a clearer understanding of why Nietzsche still matters, why he still makes people think and argue and even get a little riled up.
I think it's important to acknowledge right from the start that Nietzsche is not an easy thinker to grasp.
Right. He's known for his powerful and often provocative style of writing. It's not like reading a textbook.
Exactly. And his ideas are often complex and can be challenging to pin down. But that's part of what makes him so fascinating. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world.
And we definitely don't want to shy away from that.
Not at all. We're here to unpack those complexities, explore those uncomfortable truths, and hopefully emerge with some new insights.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Where should we start with Nietzsche? What's the best way to understand the foundation of his thought?
Well, I think the best place to begin is with the context in which he was writing. Nietzsche was living in a time of immense upheaval and change in Europe. The traditional foundations of authority, religion, morality were all being questioned and challenged.
So the old certainties were crumbling and people were searching for new ways to make sense of the world.
Exactly. And Nietzsche saw this happening all around him, and he famously declared, God is dead. Now, it's important to understand that he wasn't necessarily celebrating this. It was more of an observation, a recognition that the belief in God and all that it represented was losing his grip on Western culture.
Okay, so if God is dead, as Nietzsche proclaimed, what does that mean for us? Where do we find meaning and purpose in a world without that ultimate foundation?
That's the fundamental question that drives much of Nietzsche's work. If there's no longer a divine order, no pre-given morality, then what are we left with? How do we create meaning and value in a world that seems increasingly meaningless and valueless?
That's a pretty heavy question.
Yeah, it is. And Nietzsche doesn't shy away from its weight. He embraces it.
So how did he go about exploring these questions? Did he have any particular influences that shaped his early thinking?
Absolutely. In his early period, roughly from 1869 to 1876, we see him grappling with these ideas through the lens of other thinkers and artists who were also wrestling with the changing landscape of European culture. One major influence was Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher known for his focus on the irrational forces that drive human behavior.
Schopenhauer was pretty pessimistic, wasn't he? He saw the world as driven by a blind, striving will that ultimately leads to suffering.
Yeah, he definitely had a dark view of existence. But Nietzsche was initially drawn to Schopenhauer's emphasis on the power of the non-rational, on the instincts and drives that lie beneath the surface of our conscious minds.
So he was interested in those darker, more chaotic aspects of human nature.
Right. And this interest also connected to another key influence on Nietzsche's early work, the composer Richard Wagner.
Wagner, the guy who wrote those epic operas like The Ring Cycle.
The very same. Nietzsche saw in Wagner's music a powerful expression of these primal Dionysian energies. He believed that Wagner's art had the potential to reconnect people to the deeper, more instinctual side of themselves, something he felt was missing in modern culture.
So this early period of Nietzsche's work is all about exploring these tensions between reason and instinct, between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, as he called them.
Exactly. And these ideas really come to the forefront in his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, published in 1872.
Okay, tell me more about The Birth of Tragedy.
Well, in this book, Nietzsche uses the figures of the Greek gods Apollo and Dionysus as symbols to represent these two fundamental forces at play in human nature and in art. Apollo, the god of light, reason, and order, represents the Apollonian side, while Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and chaos, embodies the Dionysian.
I can see how those two gods would represent those contrasting forces.
Right. And Nietzsche argues that in ancient Greek tragedy, these two forces were beautifully intertwined. The audience could experience the raw, emotional power of the Dionysian through the structured beauty and form of the Apollonian. They could confront the darkest aspects of human experience, suffering, loss, even death, and emerge with a sense of catharsis and affirmation.
So the Greeks had figured out how to balance those opposing forces.
At least in their art they did. But Nietzsche believed that this balance had been lost in subsequent Western culture, with an overemphasis on the Apollonian, on reason, logic, and control, at the expense of the Dionysian, the more instinctual, passionate side of life.
And he saw Wagner's music as a potential way to reclaim that lost Dionysian energy.
Yes, at least initially. He saw in Wagner's operas a powerful resurgence of those primal forces, a way to tap into something deeper and more authentic within ourselves.
It's interesting, though, that Nietzsche later became disillusioned with Wagner.
Yeah, their relationship was complex and ultimately broke down. Nietzsche felt that Wagner's later work became too sentimental and Christianized, betraying the original spirit of the Dionysian.
And what about The Birth of Tragedy? Did he ever change his mind about that book?
He did. He later came to see it as overly romantic and metaphysical, even calling it an impossible book. But it's still a fascinating work that lays the groundwork for many of his later ideas, especially his critique of modern culture.
So, even though he distanced himself from some of his early influences, those ideas about the Apollonian and the Dionysian continue to inform his thinking.
Absolutely. He continued to see this tension between reason and instinct, between order and chaos, as central to understanding human nature and the challenges of modern life.
And this leads us to one of Nietzsche's most famous and controversial ideas, his critique of traditional morality.
Right. Nietzsche wasn't satisfied with simply accepting the moral values of his time. He wanted to understand their origins, their psychological underpinnings, and their potential consequences.
So he dug deep, questioning the very foundations of right and wrong. And this is where his concepts of master morality and slave morality come in. Right?
Exactly. Nietzsche argued that morality is not some universal, objective truth. It's a product of history, of power dynamics, of psychological needs and resentments. And he saw two main types of morality that have emerged throughout history: master morality and slave morality.
Okay, break those down for me. What's the difference?
Well, Nietzsche believed that master morality originated with the ruling classes, the nobles, the warriors. It's a morality of self-affirmation, of strength, of pride, of valuing what is good and noble in oneself and looking down on what is weak or inferior.
So it's a morality of the strong and powerful.
Right. They create their own values based on their own sense of what is excellent and life-affirming. They don't need external validation or approval. They are the judges of good and bad.
And slave morality is the opposite of that.
In a way, yes. Nietzsche saw slave morality as arising from the perspective of the oppressed, the weak, the resentful. They define good and evil in opposition to the values of the masters. What they call good is often what the masters would consider weak or contemptible, things like humility, compassion, self-sacrifice.
So slave morality is a kind of reaction to master morality.
Right. It's a way of coping with powerlessness by inverting the values of the dominant group. It says, we may be weak, but we are good, and you, the strong, are evil.
And this is where Nietzsche's critique of Christianity comes in, right? He saw it as a prime example of slave morality becoming dominant in Western culture.
Exactly. He saw Christianity as glorifying weakness and suffering, as promoting a kind of self-denying morality that goes against the grain of our natural instincts for power and self-affirmation.
So for Nietzsche, Christianity was a problem not because it was false, but because it was, in his view, life-denying.
Right. He saw it as promoting values that weaken the human spirit and hinder the development of strong, independent individuals.
Okay, so this leads us to another really controversial aspect of Nietzsche's thought, his rejection of compassion.
Yeah, this is one of those ideas that can be really hard to swallow, especially for those of us raised in cultures that value compassion as a virtue.
Right, compassion seems like a good thing, a natural human response to suffering.
And on a surface level, Nietzsche doesn't deny that. But he wants us to look deeper, to question the motivations behind our acts of compassion. He suggests that sometimes what appears to be altruism might actually be rooted in more selfish desires, a need to feel superior to the sufferer, a fear of our own vulnerability, a desire to alleviate our own discomfort at witnessing someone else's pain.
So he's not saying that compassion is always bad, but that we should be skeptical of our own motives when we feel it.
Right. He wants us to be honest with ourselves about why we do what we do, and to recognize that even seemingly virtuous actions can be driven by less than noble impulses.
But he also has deeper reasons for rejecting compassion.
Right. Yes. His more fundamental critique is that a morality based on compassion inherently views suffering as something bad, something to be avoided or eliminated at all costs. And Nietzsche challenges this assumption. He suggests that suffering can be a necessary part of growth, of self-overcoming, of achieving something truly great.
So for Nietzsche, a life without suffering might actually be a weak and shallow life.
Exactly. He believed that too much emphasis on comfort and security can lead to complacency, to a kind of spiritual stagnation. He wanted us to embrace the challenges of life, to confront our fears and limitations, to push ourselves beyond what we think we're capable of.
That's a pretty radical idea, but I can see how it connects to his overall philosophy of self-overcoming, of becoming the best version of ourselves.
It's all part of his project of reevaluating all values, of questioning the assumptions that we often take for granted.
And this questioning extends to the very idea of the self, right? Nietzsche was skeptical of the traditional notion of a fixed, unchanging soul.
He was. He saw the idea of a unified, coherent self as a kind of illusion, a convenient fiction that we create to make sense of our experience. But he believed that the reality is much more complex and fluid.
So who are we then, if not a single, stable self?
For Nietzsche, the self is more like a battleground of competing drives, instincts, and desires. It's constantly in flux, changing, evolving, becoming. There's no fixed essence, no unchanging core. We are, in a sense, a multitude.
That's a pretty mind-blowing idea. It kind of makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about yourself.
It does. And it connects to another of Nietzsche's key concepts, the will to power.
Okay, the will to power. This is one of those Nietzschean phrases that gets thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure everyone really understands what it means.
Yeah, it's often misunderstood as a kind of crude desire for domination over others, a kind of Machiavellian power grab. But for Nietzsche, it's much more nuanced than that.
So what does he mean by will to power?
Well, on one level, he sees it as a fundamental force that drives all living things, a kind of striving for growth, expansion, and overcoming resistance. But more importantly, in the context of his ethics and psychology, it refers to the individual striving for self-mastery, for increasing their own strength, creativity, and capacity for life.
So it's not about controlling others, but about controlling oneself.
Exactly. It's about pushing our own boundaries, setting challenging goals, and constantly striving to become more than we are. It's about saying yes to life in all its fullness, even its suffering, and using it as fuel for our own growth and development.
And this idea of self-overcoming, of the will to power, is ultimately what leads to the concept of the Übermensch, right?
Right. The Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman, is Nietzsche's vision of what humanity could become if we embrace this striving for self-overcoming, if we cast off the shackles of traditional morality and create our own values.
So it's like an evolutionary leap to transcendence of our current limitations.
Exactly. The Übermensch is not some superhuman being with superpowers. It's more of an ideal, a goal that we can strive towards by cultivating our own strength, creativity, and independence.
And it's about embracing the full spectrum of human experience, including the dark and difficult parts, right?
Absolutely. The Übermensch doesn't shy away from suffering or challenge. They embrace it, use it as fuel for their growth, and find meaning and purpose in it.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the death of God, master and slave morality, the rejection of compassion, the will to power, the Übermensch. But there's one more big Nietzschean idea that we need to talk about. Eternal recurrence.
Ah, yes, internal recurrence. This is one of Nietzsche's most challenging and thought-provoking ideas.
I remember when I first encountered this concept, it was like, whoa, mind blown.
Yeah, it's a real head trip.
So what is eternal recurrence exactly?
It's the idea that everything that has happened is happening and will happen, will repeat itself infinitely. Every moment, every event, every joy, every sorrow, every triumph, every failure, it all happens again and again and again in an endless cycle.
So it's like a cosmic rewind button that keeps getting pressed.
Kind of. But it's important to remember that Nietzsche didn't necessarily present this as a literal cosmological truth. He saw it more as a thought experiment, a way of testing our attitude towards life.
Okay, a thought experiment. So how does that work?
Imagine this. A demon appears before you and tells you that you will have to relive your entire life, every detail, every moment, exactly as it happened, over and over again, for eternity. Would you embrace this fate, or would you curse the demon?
Wow, that's heavy. I think I need some time to process that.
That's the point. It's a way of forcing us to confront the question of whether we are truly living a life that we would want to live again eternally. If the thought of reliving all your mistakes and regrets fills you with dread, then maybe it's a sign that you need to make some changes.
So eternal recurrence is a way of holding ourselves accountable, of making sure that we're living a life that we wouldn't want to change.
Exactly. It's about finding a way to affirm life in all its complexity, even its suffering, and to embrace the present moment as if it were eternal.
That's a powerful idea, but it's also pretty demanding.
It is. But for Nietzsche, it's the ultimate test of our will to power, our ability to say yes to life, even when it's difficult.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk a bit about Nietzsche's views on politics and society. There's this tendency to try to categorize him as a left-winger or right-winger, but it seems like his ideas don't really fit neatly into either box.
You're absolutely right. Nietzsche was a fiercely independent thinker who resisted easy categorization. He was critical of both the left and the right, and his views on politics and society were often complex and nuanced.
So what were some of his main criticisms of the political movements of his time?
Well, he was very critical of both socialism and democracy, seeing them as systems that promote mediocrity and suppress the development of exceptional individuals. He believed that they stifle creativity and individuality, leading to a kind of leveling down of society.
So he was more of an elitist, in a sense.
He was, but not in the traditional sense of supporting a hereditary aristocracy. He was more interested in an aristocracy of spirit, a society that values and cultivates the exceptional, the creative, the strong-willed.
And he was also a vocal critic of nationalism, wasn't he?
He was. He saw nationalism as a dangerous force that promotes tribalism, conflict, and a narrow, limited perspective. He believed in a more cosmopolitan worldview, one that transcends national boundaries and embraces the diversity of human cultures.
And what about his views on anti-Semitism? There's been a lot of debate about that, especially given the way his work was later appropriated by the Nazis.
It's important to remember that Nietzsche was writing in a time when anti-Semitism was widespread in Europe. And while some of his early writings contain passages that could be interpreted as anti-Semitic, his later work clearly rejects any form of racial prejudice. He was a fierce critic of his sister, Elizabeth, for her involvement with the German nationalist and anti-Semitic movement.
So it's fair to say that Nietzsche's views on these issues were complex and evolved over time.
Absolutely. He was a thinker who was constantly questioning and revising his own ideas. And his work is full of contradictions and ambiguities. But one thing is clear. He was a passionate advocate for individual freedom, self-overcoming, and the creation of new values.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Friedrich Nietzsche, what are some of the key takeaways that our listener can take with them?
Well, I think one of the most important things to remember is that Nietzsche was not a nihilist. He wasn't trying to tear down all values and leave us with nothing. He was trying to challenge us to create new values, to find meaning and purpose in a world without God, without absolute truth, without pre-given morality.
So it's about embracing the freedom and responsibility that comes with living in a world without those old certainties.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we are the creators of our own values, our own meaning, our own destiny. And that's a daunting task, but it's also incredibly liberating.
It's like Nietzsche saying, okay, the old world is gone. Now it's up to you to create something new, something better, something truly your own.
And he gives us some powerful tools for doing just that. His ideas about the will to power, the Übermensch, eternal recurrence, they're all meant to help us tap into our own inner strength and creativity and forge a path forward in a world that's constantly changing.
It's a challenging philosophy, for sure, but it's also one that offers a lot of hope and possibility.
And I think that's why Nietzsche continues to resonate with people today. He speaks to our deepest longings for meaning and purpose, even in a world that can often feel meaningless and chaotic.
He challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world, and to embrace the power and responsibility that comes with being human.
And I think that's a message that's worth wrestling with, even if it doesn't always give us easy answers.
Absolutely. So as we emerge from this deep dive into the world of Friedrich Nietzsche, I want to leave our listener with a question. What values are you creating and affirming in your own life? What is it that you would truly will to return again and again in internal recurrence? And now, dear listener, if this exploration into the depths of Nietzsche's thought has ignited a spark within you, a flicker of understanding, a surge of curiosity, a connection to the power of ideas, then let that energy flow outward. Like the ceaseless becoming that Nietzsche explored, let the All Sorts podcast ripple through the landscape of online conversations. If you've found value in these sonic explorations, these curated deep dives into the heart of knowledge, then lend your strength to our current. Like this deep dive, share it with others who might be intrigued, and subscribe to the All Sorts podcast on YouTube. Let our library of ideas grow, our community deepen. And know that countless other intellectual adventures await you in our archives, other podcasts already crafted, waiting to ignite new perspectives. Follow the threads of curiosity beyond this dive. Find us on X, Instagram, and Threads. Your engagement fuels our exploration, allowing us to continue charting these fascinating territories until our next deep dive into the all sorts of things that shape our understanding. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking.